Okay, welcome back. So this is the last lecture on Gatsby, and as much as I love going through this book, I'm pretty anxious to get started with Their Eyes Are Watching God, because it just excites me to always start a new book. And it's also, I just was reading this yesterday, one of the awards she got, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was on 1925, which is when The Great Gatsby was published. So she is writing during the Harlem Renaissance, and it's not really about so much universally the American dream, but particularly a woman's quest and dream. So I'll be talking about that next time. I'll do an introduction. So if you want to listen to the introduction, that'll be free on YouTube, and then you can decide if you want to buy the course. But I think it would be worth having that book under your belt as well, because it just, the right question may come up, and it's not a long read, and it's not a hard read. Some people find it hard just because of the language that she uses, a lot of slang. But once you get past that, the story is pretty straightforward. So anyways, I look forward to doing that. But so poor Gatsby has died, and except the only people who seem to be extremely interested is the media, and coming in and writing stories about what happened and taking pictures, and there's interested, curious little boys wanting to get a look at the pool or the body. And it's very sad to Nick, because this is what his life has basically come down to. And he is trying to find people to actually attend the funeral. Tom and Daisy skip town, they're gone, or at least they say they're gone. Daisy won't even talk to Nick at this time. And he even tries his old friend Meyer Wolfsham, and he says, let us show our love for a person while he's alive and not dead. And he kind of gives this mobster answer that once someone dies, I'm out. I don't get involved after that. And I guess that was a pretty hard, fast rule, because I know we've seen that many times in other movies and so forth. But what's interesting is his dad comes, and he's a frail older man, and his impression is when he sees, he asks where Jimmy is, and so he takes him up there, and he says that he had reached an age where death no longer had the quality of ghastly surprise. And when he looked around him now for the first time, he saw the height and splendor of the hall and the great rooms opening into the other rooms. His grief began to be mixed with awed pride. And so he talks about his son, and his son has kind of this Ben Franklin mentality. And Ben Franklin was like, who I think probably started the self-help books. Now you could get on YouTube all the time, and you have all these motivative things and these rules that you have to do. It's kind of a Puritan idea to that idea of self-improvement, and I think because the Puritans had to have a good work ethic or they would starve, that somehow that work ethic and spirituality, idle hands is the devil's handiwork, and too much leisure, too much fun. The Puritans weren't real big on drinking and dancing, and they knew that man was just weak, and if he didn't watch himself very carefully, he would end up a drunkard or something like that. I mean, we're fallen people. We're men. We're a mess, right? So the way that they tried to control that is to just be very strict, and also just having good habits. So I think when you compare America with other countries, and you're looking at why we have a shorter maternity leave or take less vacations or anything like that, I think it comes back to our Puritan culture. I had this French teacher I was friends with, and we had prom duty together one year, and she was like, "This is so boring. Why isn't there any alcohol?" We used to, in France, we would drink with our students, and like, we don't do that here. For one thing, we can't control ourselves, so who knows what would happen if that happened. Um, but that's another good point too, is that people get really repressed. And I think that's kind of what you saw that came out of the prohibition, is as soon as you tell people they can't drink, and what happens? People find a way to get it anyhow, and then they go overboard. And I was talking to one of my friends who was Orthodox, and she said, you know, we were always drinking wine with our meals, and alcohol was always around, and no one was really considered an alcoholic. And then you come to this country, and people seem to have a lot of problems with alcohol. Well, I think it comes from having a very repressed background. But when he pulls out this list that says, you know, I'm going to rise from, I remember doing this too when I was a teenager. I was pretty a wild teenager, but there was also a part of me that really wanted to succeed. And I had actually like make self lists for myself to do this, do homework at this time, and then, you know, spend more time with parents and stuff like that. I did that too, and you have a list of what he would do, and the dad says, you know, this shows it. This shows that he would have been a great man if he lived. And Nick, knowing how he got his money, is thinking, okay, maybe, but probably not. The truth is, he probably would have ended up dead one way or another. And yet, but he did have that entrepreneurial spirit about him that knew, if I could do these things, I can achieve. And I think there is some truth to that, though. I really do. I think that I heard one time at a commencement speech that anything that you can measure, you can achieve. So if you can write it down and you can see it in front of you, and you can just take one step after another step and have a vision, and you see a lot, you know, of people who become wealthy just out of discipline. So when I say this as kind of a critique of American values and stuff, I'm not saying it doesn't work, because I think it can, and I'm not saying just because we believe that God's providence that it's not there. It may be. But what's important is to recognize it in the text so that you have something to analyze when you see signs of something like this. Another good person, if you're interested in this topic as far as Puritans and the effect of, you know, American history with that, look at Sarah Vowell. She is a voice, most people will recognize her because you'll recognize her voice from The Incredibles. She's Violet. But she's actually a historian, and I think definitely a scholar. But she writes humorous books. Like for the Puritans, she wrote Wordy Shipmates, and I read that a while back, and I was so happy when I saw somebody talk about this, because it was all the things that I had been thinking when I was in my classes in American Lit, and especially in regards to religion. And then I was listening to like book TV, because it's like the only TV I watch, and she was on, and I was just, you know, I didn't even know the connection with Incredibles until later, but that didn't matter. She's just worth listening to. Her name is Sarah Vowell, if you want to look her up. Wordy Shipmates. And there's a book talk, and she actually talks about this scene too, about how happy he is about this house and, you know, everything he has, and she says, yeah, his son did just die in a pool, but at least it was a fancy pool. And I think that's kind of the tragedy. When you're young and you read Gatsby, just like I did when I was younger, I don't know that I ever really saw Gatsby as a tragic figure. And I don't know if just by watching the movie that you could really see how tragic it is, and without having read some of the other parts of the book, because you don't really see just how delusional he is about Daisy, and that one dream and that one bit of hope, you know, that he had, and doing everything that he can to make this one thing in his life happen, which really you can't control because it was dependent on another person. And it's never good to try to, whatever your dreams or goals are, don't count on other people to be there for you because they may not show up or something may happen. But that's where you have to be careful about where you put your faith in. That's what I'm saying, I guess. So enough preaching on that. So let me get back to the funeral. There is this one moment, and you notice he usually just does something with one little anecdote that explains a lot. And that is when the one guy calls and he thinks, oh, good, finally someone's going to go to the funeral, is interested in the funeral. And he says, actually, in fact, I was wondering if you could get my shoes. I left a pair of shoes there. I'm just helpless without them. And so he ends up hanging up on this guy. And then another guy that he found a number for, he said one gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he got what he deserved. However, this was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of his liquor. So it kind of shows you how shallow and just materialistic people are. They don't really care about what's happened to him. And this also reminds me of the ending of Death of a Salesman, which would be another piece to look at while you're thematically looking at, which is how I usually try to study literature, which is why I'm going to do Their Eyes Are Watching God next. But it wouldn't take you very long to read Death of a Salesman, watch the movie with the play with Dustin Hoffman, and look at those elements, and you will find a lot of things that you see here are there too. And nobody comes to Willie Loman's funeral either. And they're so surprised because all this time he's talked about how much he's liked, and he has all these friends everywhere and connections, and none of it is true. It's all something that's been made up in his head, in his imagination. So after the funeral, we get to, one guy does show up, and it's no surprise to me that the one guy that shows up is the guy who was in the library. He's the reader, because those people tend to be deeper than other people. And even though at the end he says, oh, poor son of a bitch. I mean, here's a guy that just made it big, and that's what you say at his funeral? That's the end of it? So it really kind of goes to show that it doesn't really matter how much money you make. You can't haul it with you. And, your lives are better spent thinking about your purpose and what you can do for other people rather than what you can attain, because you can't keep it. And nobody really cares about it anyways. So he gets back to this nostalgic time where he thinks about the place that he's from, the West. And this is it's beautiful writing for one thing, but I also think structurally it's interesting that he doesn't say this in the beginning. We don't have a real good feel about who he is, where he's from, but he does say this at the end, and I think he does it as a way of contrasting. Most of the time, that's why we use the word juxtaposition so much, is because most of the time that's what we're doing is having this stark contrast. So when he thinks back of when they would get out of school and snow, it would be snowing, and it was the real snow, and he says, that's my Middle West, not the wheat. That's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost wheat towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth, and the street lamps and the sleigh bells and the frosty dark and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. I'm part of that, a little solemn with the feel of long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway House, in a city where dwellings are still called through decades by a family's name. I see now that this has been a story of the West, after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. And so I think what you have here is this feeling of being in the East is so much out of place. But they were also, or at least everyone but Gatsby had a name given to them. They didn't really have to work like Gatsby. They were in decades of their family's names, and that's what gave them their opportunities. And I think it's a little bit still like that. Some people don't really understand the American dream because they don't have to struggle as much as somebody like Gatsby. And so it's really hard for them to appreciate it. But he also says when he gets to West Egg, it reminded him of a El Greco painting and it kind of haunted him. You know, 100 houses at once, conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen overhanging sky and a lusterless moon. In the foreground, 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely, the men turn in at a house, the wrong house. But no one knows the woman's name, and no one cares. And so there's something that's kind of missing in that West where people are trying to make it, and maybe that's what I was saying before about being kind of repressed. They just kind of go nuts once they get there, and you know, the struggle of making it, and that's kind of what Willy Loman is, a tragic character. You know, he compares his apartment in the city, and he basically hates it, and he wants to go back where he had grass. He says, you know, the grass doesn't grow here. And and I think it's, you know, it's saying something about industrialization as well, and how we're really just not that adaptable to it, probably for a reason. And now, I mean, they don't imagine what these people would be writing with the technological age, you know, and what they would be saying about the dysfunction of social media and all of that. But just even at just such a small, to us, such a small level of development seems contrary to our human nature and sort of distorts our point of view in a way. So he lets go of, he breaks it off with Jordan. She said she felt a little dizzy after, you know, he broke it off with him. And really she doesn't, you know, seem to know love any better than Nick. So it was just a matter of formality of just breaking it off, and she's over it. And then this is what I think is interesting. Back to who was driving the car. He has a conversation. He runs into Tom. And at first he doesn't want to shake Tom's hand. And Tom's coming at him in his usual aggressive way. And, you know, he says, "You're crazy." "Tom," I inquired, "what did you say to Wilson that afternoon?" And he says, "I told him the truth. He came to the door and we were getting ready to leave and sent word, when I sent word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me." And then he says, "Well, what if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust in your eyes, just like he did Daisy. He was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over some dog and never even stopped his car." Here's what bothers me about this. I think Tom is telling the truth because Tom doesn't really have a reason to lie. Now, he thinks Gatsby did it if he's telling the truth. So does that mean that Daisy lied to Tom? They're married. No matter what she does or did, Tom is going to protect her. She has no reason to lie to Tom. You know, if she was the one who did it, I think in a state of mind like that, people want to be confessional. They have to get the truth out. Even some people later on who didn't get, convicted for something, end up getting convicted later on because they can't stand not telling the truth. After some time, it just bothers them and they just tell the wrong people. So I don't think Daisy has a reason to lie to Tom. I don't think Tom has a reason to lie to Nick. And I don't know if Fitzgerald is on purpose trying to make this ambiguous, or it could just be an inconsistency that it's being read like this. But all Nick can think of when he says this is that there was nothing I could say except one utterable fact, that it wasn't true. So the only reason we know it's not true is because of Gatsby, who never tells the truth. But just to play devil's advocate, because whatever side you want to take on this is fine if you decide to write about it. You just need to give an analysis of why. So if you do want to insist that Tom and Daisy, or that Daisy was driving, one of the arguments that you could make is that number one is that one part where anyone could tell they were conspiring together. You could use that line. Or you could make the point that it's Tom and Daisy who end up killing in the novel. That's Tom kills Gatsby's dream. Daisy kills Myrtle. You see, so if you wanted to take that direction, if you believed it or if you didn't believe it, doesn't matter. If it makes a good argument for you, work with it. It doesn't matter. But it's always, I'm always curious to see how a movie is going to show this, and I think usually they imply that Gatsby does try to take the will, and otherwise don't show the scene at all and just let it be ambiguous, is what I think. Because I don't think you have enough proof to show Daisy. And it's kind of like what I know that in my women in literature class, and the professor was definitely a feminist, so, take it for whatever you think. But she didn't think Daisy was driving, and she said that it was part of that tendency to blame the woman. Or, because Nick says very early on, you can't expect women to tell the truth. And yet we don't know who's telling the truth between Gatsby or Tom or whatever. So is it our nature to just see Daisy doing something wrong, or has Gatsby thrown dust in our eyes? And I asked that to a student one time who wanted to argue with me about this, and I don't know. The only one who knows is Fitzgerald. But I did suggest that maybe Gatsby threw dust in your eyes too. And maybe there's a part of us that really, like Nick, wants to believe, even if it's not rational. Because we want to believe in the dream. And we want to be like Gatsby too. So that's just something to think about. But he does say, and this is a very good line, as he walks away from Tom, he realizes that it's foolish not to shake his hand. It was almost like talking to a child. Tom doesn't have, a very high conscience. He's not, he goes back in, and I think he describes, he went to go in and buy whatever. Actually, let me just read this part. I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed things up in creatures and then retreated back into their money. This would be a really good line to memorize. You don't have to memorize a lot of lines, but you've got to memorize some, just to make sure you have something to work with, to analyze. And especially if you wanted to say that Daisy was driving, then use this line, that they were careless people, they smashed things up, and they retreated back to their money. Even if you don't get it right, you don't have to put quotes around it, just say generally what they said. And that's very specific evidence, which is what it also asks you to do in your examples, right? And he says, and let other people clean up the mess they made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I was talking to a child, like a man-child. Then he went into his jewelry store and bought a pearl necklace, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons. Rid my provincial squeamishness forever. And then he tries to go back and he talks about New York and how he spent his Saturday nights and gleaming, dazzling parties. And it seems like he's looking at it now with just a really bad hangover. He's partied out. And he can still hear the music and the laughter. And it's kind of like being the only sober one when you're with a drunk crowd. And everyone's just having a very good time on the liquor. But if you're not there, then it just seems like it's kind of overdone. And that's the way New York was for him. So when he looks back out at the water, this is towards the end, and there is a lot of water imagery through the novel as well. And then, of course, Gatsby dies by drowning, was shot, but he's in the pool, right? So this is where he kind of goes back to this is like the American quintessential part that's very American-esque. And he's brooding back on history. I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house and had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation that neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And that's, kind of going back to, where does this all start? This first American dream. And what did people have to do to maintain it, to really make it their own? So he says, as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way from the blue lawn, and the dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And I really don't know that I can elaborate on something like that. It's just too beautiful. But one thing you could do if this was a prose that's catching my attention is noticing the dashes. When he says, one fine morning, that dash has a purpose. In the punctuation, when you're talking about the prose, you have to find a way to try to figure out the sentence patterns mean something. What is that? We don't have the answer. All we really have is the hope. It's out there. It's in the distance. Just like Lacan's desire. It's not attainable, really. Desire always has to be out there. It always has to be what we haven't gotten a hold of yet. Because if you had it, you wouldn't want it. And so we are like against this current. But we keep on. And we don't stop. And that is what, the American novel in this text is about. The expedition, the quest, and the hope of the American dream. So I hope you'll join me for Their Eyes Are Watching God. And we will, again, go back to kind of the identity, a little bit of feminism. And a lot of what I say in one course, I'm probably going to use in another course. But the more courses you watch, the better you're going to do on this test, because I think now you could write a pretty good Q3 question for the Gatsby. And it's all about the analysis and the interpretation. All right, thanks.